afternoon, everyone. Let me just welcome you to our 51st Annual Scholars Conference. As you will have noticed, this year we are conducting this in a slightly different way. In the end, we decided to go with this slightly different format. Three keynote speakers. We started out with Yehuda Bauer. Now we're at the second, and then we have one more to go. We are otherwise, I think, hopefully at a point, I mean, to be sure, we love connecting with you in this particular way, but we are slowly but surely, hopefully getting to that part where we can start thinking again about other ways of having events. Now, Zoom is close to our hearts, no doubt, but I think face-to-face events are too. So under normal circumstances, I would now spend a little bit of time welcoming you, all of you, to our beautiful campus and to all the things that are noteworthy. Trust me, it is beautiful, but since you're not going to get to see it, I shorten it a little bit. So let me just also welcome you to the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. That this is a center that I'm proud to direct. It's a center that has now 5 endowed chairs in Holocaust studies. So in that respect, it's quite a rich and varied program. We have a very talented and very wide-ranging faculty: Pedro Gonzalez, Ara Valente, Deborah Pfister, David Patterson, and myself. And we try to really think about the Holocaust, coming to it from a different geographies, from different perspectives as far as disciplines and the likes are concerned. But while we're doing that, we also, have to be mindful sometimes of our limits. And I think in the midst of this virtual version of this conference, I was very much trying to find someone who will open up like a different perspective, something that normally we don't quite so often encounter. And the trick was just to get onto our calendar, because I don't think I was the only one looking for something like that. And so I'm therefore really, really thrilled to welcome today Mehnaz Afridi, the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. She represents a very different genealogy of a scholar also, who received her MA or BA first from Syracuse University in English and Religious Studies, continued that with another MA at Syracuse in Religious Studies, and then eventually with a Religious Studies, a PhD from the University of South Africa, which means there are 3 to 4 different disciplines and actually entirely different geographies wrapped up in what interests us. And that's why we're so excited to have her. So she's a scholar of literature who has worked on, in particular, on the Turkish novelist Pamuk, who was in 2006 a Nobel Prize winner. I think she just sticks it out with winners, though, because her other passion, in as far as literature has it, is with the Egyptian writer Mahfouz, who was also a Nobel Prize winner. Now, in between, she has done all kinds of other things, but most notably and most, the reason why she's here is she has published a widely acknowledged book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. And that's really for us important, that we start to introduce ourselves via our gifted and talented speaker into another way of looking at it. And so to speak, trading our own eyes today for another pair or another couple of eyes to look at something that is on one level probably and hopefully familiar to us, the Holocaust, but in other ways, hopefully will give us a very different way into this. But it also reminds us, and that's really critical, and that's why I was so keen on emphasizing geography, that the geographies of the Holocaust themselves are far more complicated than we sometimes think. They are not limited by the Mediterranean, and that in many ways, the history of the Holocaust extends beyond the Mediterranean into North Africa and into the Middle East. Something that, because we seem to so centered on this kind of quote unquote central parts of Europe, we often don't quite see. I'm going to hand now over to you, Mehnaz, because you're going to talk about this so much better than I will. And so here you go. Thank you for coming today and joining us.
Thank you so much, Niels, and it's so nice to meet you and talk with you. And I'm really, really honored to be here. Following Yehuda Bauer is a huge honor for me, and I feel like a little, piece of a sandwich. And the next speaker is, of course, amazing. And I want to thank the Ackerman Center and the University of Dallas, and as well as the Jaffa family. I believe this is in honor of them. So thank you again. And I just want to say that this this book that has been published has also been taught now in curriculum and in courses. So I'm really, really, really happy about that, and how it's also being taught in high school. So, for me, curriculum is very important as an educator. So I'm very honored that I'm here talking about this, and my work becomes even more and more complicated as I start thinking of just this initial book on the Shoah. So let me begin. So on January 23rd, 2020, American Jewish Committee's Executive Director, David Harris, organized a religious group from the Muslim World League to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Muhammad al-Isa, the Secretary General of the Mecca-based Muslim World League and a former Saudi Justice Minister, arrived at Auschwitz alongside Muslim religious leaders from several countries and a delegation of American Jewish Committee officials. Isa, the Muslim clerics, and the AJC officials toured the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, as well as visit the Nozyk Synagogue in the Polish capital and a local mosque, and finally shared an interfaith Shabbat meal. Muhammad al-Isa said, "I urge all Muslims to learn the history of the Holocaust, to visit memorials and museums of this horrific event, and to teach its lesson to their children." End quote. A historic trip, perhaps, or is it ceremonial? Symbolically, this is a very important trip. And a couple of summers ago, the summer before COVID, I led a group of 52 Jewish Muslim women through the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom to Auschwitz and Berlin. A powerful and sustaining educational trip with women from different walks of life, different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we also were able to talk about Israel and Palestine. But the most important thing we did on this trip was that I was able to help them. I mean, you can't lead people through Auschwitz because of their rules, but help them think about what the Holocaust meant for Jews as a Muslim. I also was able to find names of Muslims that were exterminated at Auschwitz. So the Jewish Muslim women and I stood there and prayed for both Jewish and Muslim victims. My own scholarly work and activism came out of many questions about Jewish Muslim history. With a PhD in Islam, as Niels mentioned, and an MA, and concentrating on the 19th-20th century German philosophy and the Holocaust, I wanted to somehow merge my two passions. So tonight, or today, I will begin with some broad questions. Why were and are Jews perceived as colonists by Muslims? Why is it important for Muslims to learn about the Holocaust and Judaism? And what can we say about two communities in different situations at different moments in time? In other words, how can we remember our history in multidimensional ways that create bridges between the two communities? I share here some personal nuances, moving to my own research in Holocaust studies, and then some new initiatives that I think can bring us some optimism at a time in the United States and Europe where we are all challenged by political and rhetorical changes and transformations in our social climate. Changes that challenge our work and seem to walk us back through the past that we may see as dark, unrecoverable, and insurmountable. But today I want to add some nuance, some context, and a bit of hope in the sometimes dark abyss that glares at us both existentially and politically in terms of racism and prejudice in the 21st century. So I'll turn a few corners in my paper framed by what I call the plateau, or even an epoch, as Edmund Husserl defined, as an extended period, a resting place, and in this context, the place of memory for Jews and Muslims during the Holocaust. Or as Henri Bergson put it in his seminal book, Matter and Memory, the pure present is an ungraspable advance of the past, devouring the future. In truth, all sensation is already memory. And even before that, Marcel Proust put it, remembrance of things past is not necessarily the remembrance of things as they were. In 2016, I visited Berlin, Germany, and I've been there a few times after that, where I was invited for the release of the third German edition of the responses to Die Sonnenblume by Simon Wiesenthal, as I was invited myself to write a response from a Muslim perspective. So it was a publication celebration. I met many Germans who were interested in my role as a Muslim woman teaching Islam and also directing a Holocaust center. Their questions came from shock, dismay, and perhaps a backlash. I wondered as they inquired how I could possibly be entrapped in two polarizing and extreme visions of the world, Jewish and Muslim. The most startling comments were how I could call myself a Muslim since I did not wear that thing on my head, meaning the hijab, and why I would be deeply committed to Holocaust education. And lastly, the most horrific was, could I not find something better to do? Some comments horrified my American and now Berliner host, such as voting for Hitler was the only thing we could have done. Awkward silence, brisk acknowledgments by the local Berliners became a stark message to me that somehow my own identity as a Muslim was sterilized, and my work on the Holocaust had been battered in the most apologetic country of European crimes during World War II. Later on, a few years ago, I was invited to Miami, Florida, to speak for the local Muslim community on Jewish-Muslim relations. Then I was invited to speak to a few Muslim leaders. I sat with 5 respectful, professional Muslim men who were considered leaders in the Muslim American communities in Miami, as you know, a city with a large Jewish population. I was there to have a conversation about Muslim perceptions of Jews and how we can change our view, taking into consideration principles of Islam. I was asked the following questions about Jews. Don't you think they control political events? Aren't they all rich, Mehnaz? Some of them had never asked those questions openly, and I was there as a Muslim to respond. This intimate conversation is one of several I've had about the perception of Jews in Muslim communities, whether they are Turkish, Indian, Pakistani, Saudi, Iraqi, or others. We discussed the Shoah, and I was instantly confronted with questions about other genocides in comparison. This discussion was immensely important, though, in many ways. First, it allowed male Muslim leaders to listen to a Muslim woman speak about Jews. Second, it offered a reference point in the religion when they go out in the community. And finally, they were open to pursuing the deepening of Jewish-Muslim relations because they admitted that they did not know enough. One of the many issues that were brought up was concern about the Quranic scriptures and discussion and that discuss Jews or Christians in a negative light. The Quran has many such verses that can be negative and ambiguous for the non-Muslim, and especially Muslims. And on the other hand, my work with Jewish community leaders is led by the following question at times. Is the Quran anti-Semitic? My response is clearly no. Actually, I have a whole chapter in my book on that topic itself. Such a response requires that we understand the Quran and the representation of Jews in the Islamic tradition. So these incidences, and many more that I cannot recount today, but I do in my book, have strengthened my work on the Shoah and my Islamic identity. And both Muslims and Jews compelled me to think about how we remember our own history and, more importantly, other people's memory. The challenges I face is Holocaust denial, relativization, or blatant anti-Semitism seeped in the words Israel and Zionism. The challenges I face personally as a Muslim is Islamophobia on the streets, the perception of Muslims, women, and immigrant policies that have isolated many Muslims, including my children. Most of these challenges have been wrought with how we, through generations, in these specific communities, think of one another. Or as I say, remember each other, or even acknowledge one another's history. Or is it, as Bresson says, all sensation already a memory? How has one learned to recall the other's tradition? What moments in history are the ones that define us and those that do not? David Reef's book on In Praise of Forgetting, Historical Memory and Its Ironies, he asked the important questions of memory, tradition, and ethics. He further questions how and what we choose to commemorate, forgive, and forget. What shall I never forget? I ask myself, the loss, the death, and the need for humans to kill and destroy my identity. David Reeves' chapter, though, entitled "Must We Deform the Past in Order to Preserve It" is very telling. It resonated with me in two ways. One, that memory of a particular past is framed morally by human beings as either positive or negative, in this case a deformed memory, as Reeve puts it. Two, that nostalgia, or how one recollects the past, can protect or destroy memory, as he further states. At some point in time, will not Nazi atrocities, collaboration, even the Shoah itself, become plain history? Question mark. My question is, how do we transition our own memories of one another that are not only the creation of our community's memory, but how we have actually deformed the memories of the other to protect our own narrative? I wondered many times whether I ever did crawl out of my zone and confront the memory of someone else's past. And does this move have a morality in order for us to move beyond the memory of an old enemy, perpetrator, and murderer? This is what compelled some of the work I did in my book, but more importantly, I wanted to ask some deeper questions about the construction of who we are against someone else's sensation of memory. In other words, Jews who were murdered, suffered, and survived must also be part of my memory, or at least a common memory that Muslims may partake in. But I found that Muslims had reconstructed Jewish history from the creation of Israel for many generations, or sometimes even from the Balfour Declaration in 1919. As for some Jews, they had adopted the Orientalism attitude and perceptions of Arabs as other, uncivilized, and violent. These memories had transformed through frozen moments of historical pain, to name a few for both communities: anti-Semitism, Holocaust, colonialism, and the birth and the creation of the State of Israel, and then the Nakba. There is a growing historiography, though, of Jewish-Muslim encounters during the Holocaust, and most of this research has focused on the Arab world. Scholars have shown the collaboration of the Mufti Al-Husseini of Jerusalem, which is an engraved memory with an imminent photo of the Mufti sitting with Hitler. Quote from Mutadil: "The Mufti who came to Berlin during the war called in his propaganda speeches for the annihilation of Jews, and even became involved in the Holocaust, successfully intervening to stop the immigration of Jews from Germany's southeastern European satellite states to Palestine in 1943. Undoubtedly, this is extremely important, but I wanted to further my research and look at what happened to the many ordinary Muslims that were not part of the Husseini plan, nor his small army. Some Muslims were clearly displaced by communism, dictatorship, and economy, who were caught in the front zones and were killed alongside millions of others. The story of North Africa, as told brilliantly by Robert Satlov in Amongst the Righteous, Lost Stories from the Holocaust, explains that this is what the Muslims did. Not only did such persecution exist where Arabs lived, but Arabs played a role at every level. Some went door to door with the Germans, pointing out Jews for arrest. Others led Jewish workers on forced marches or served as overseers at labor camps. They manned the railroads that took bewildered European Jews deep into the Sahara, prepared the gruel that passed for food at torture sites, patrolled the streets of Bizerte, Tunis, and Sousse, armed with guns and clubs, looking for Jewish escapees. Some took these jobs because they needed money to feed their families. Others volunteered because they were zealous about their work. Every person's story was different, but the common thread that connected them all was a shared undeniability. And so this became very important to me as kind of a gap in terms of looking at Holocaust studies. I mean, Omar Boum does this work, Robert Satlow, David Mutadil. I'm actually in a series with them, doing a series on Muslims and the Holocaust. But I wanted to, first of all, expand Holocaust education through this work, which is really important, and also include the fact that the Holocaust was unprecedented because it went absolutely everywhere you can imagine, through the Vichy government and also Germany's own control of Tunisia. So there's this whole gap in knowledge, not only just in Holocaust studies, but also, of course, in the Arab and the Muslim world. And so I wanted to bring these stories to my community, or to communities that are Arabs. I'm not Arab. I'm an Asian Muslim. But I wanted to sort of expand this knowledge in a way that would be really useful for people. And I think this is starting to happen a lot more. However, we know that most Arabs and Muslims were not primarily collaborators, and certainly not perpetrators of the Shoah, but some had knowledge about the labor camps under the Vichy government in countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, and colonized Algeria. It is important that Arabs recognize the historical evidence of such camps in light of the collaboration of Arabs, and more important, the Arab rescue of Jews, which is another whole, actually wonderful stories. The existence of labor and concentration camps in these Arab countries is a testimony to the power and reach of Nazi Germany and the Vichy governments. I mean, I know that most of you have seen Martin Gilbert's atlas, but it's really worth re-looking at, to look at where all these camps were, because he really maps it out. And then further, I mean, much later on, Satlov does the same thing, but it's kind of stuck because there's no real narrative and evidence that we can find in these archives when we look at North Africa. So, I mean, if you have some time, look back at that atlas, because I always show it to my students when I'm teaching Muslims in the Holocaust, and they're always fascinated about exactly where this went. Also, I don't think I've written this, but I just wanted to mention as an anecdote that that Jews who were just visiting family in these areas were also persecuted. Not only were they persecuted, but they were all taken all the way to Auschwitz and killed. It's an incredible matrix of the complexity that goes in North Africa during colonial times and during the Vichy, under, of course, a Nazi regime. But here I want to see some kind of way of thinking a little differently, and understand that perhaps there's something we can do here as Jews and Muslim scholars and non-scholars to think about what this means. Colonial occupation in the Arab and Muslim world has also been overlooked in the discussion of its history. The evidence of camps in these areas demonstrates challenging circumstances under the colonial forces at local levels. This is where we can hope that recalling memory of one another as a specificity of each one's history could connect Arabs to Jews in a different manner. The Shoah crept into places where even Jewish survivors had no knowledge. Arab lands, and at the end of the talk, when I have a little 5-minute clip I want you to see, when I did my own interviews with survivors, which are the most meaningful thing I've done so far, probably in my life. And I was surprised when I asked the Jewish survivors whether they knew about the camps in the Arab lands, and they were shocked by this fact. I wanted to bridge the misperceptions, and as a Muslim, create a point of understanding. If I could point out the terrible onslaught of anti-Semitism and simultaneously explore how Arabs became implicated in the catastrophe of the Shoah, Arabs' role in the Shoah was minimum at best, yet the contact, the witnessing, exchange, and perpetration during this time has been a lost story. Arabs were not the primary perpetrators, although Netanyahu did say this a few years ago, but then I corrected it on media, and you can Google that, of the persecution of Jews, nor did they have any similar anti-Semitic laws that were found in Italy, France, and most especially in Germany. Arabs were in a different predicament, humiliated, powerless, and under colonial rule. However, this journey is about acceptance, sympathy, and attempting to eradicate the myths about Jews, but not to blame everything on colonialism. And this is sort of a conundrum in terms of being somebody who teaches Islam and teaches, I do courses on Muslims in America, Islamic literature, women in Islam. Right now I'm teaching a book on, a whole seminar on the Quran. And one of the things that I think, a lot of Muslim scholars, and I do too sometimes, find myself falling into this trap of, but where there was hundreds of years of colonization. And there were. And this is why we have a problem and a fragmentation of identity in many parts of the Muslim world, including where I was born in Pakistan. So as a Muslim woman who teaches about the Shoah in Islam, I often see many eyebrows raised at the connection of these two very terms in academia and the arena of politics. How can Muslims have any connection to the Shoah? The only real collaboration, like I said in the beginning, we've seen between Muslims and Shoah is the image of the Mufti Al-Husseini and Hitler sitting together, or the idea that Muslims were complacent about the extermination of Jews in Europe. However, what was being planned was an enormous alliance with the Arab world that relied increasingly on Islamic ideas for propaganda purposes, with Jewish hatred being at the forefront. The famous encounter between Hitler and Al-Husseini on November 28, 1941, is recorded as following, and I quote, "Their conversation was limited to an exchange of empty courtesies and the affirmation that they were fighting against common enemies, the British, Jews, and Bolshevism. When Al-Husseini asked Hitler for a written guarantee of Arab and especially Palestinian independence, the dictator evaded the issue. After Al-Husseini's repeated request, Hitler told him that in the current state of war, it was too early for these kinds of questions, but asserted his uncompromising fight against the Jews, which also included Jews of the Arab lands. Another request for a meeting with Hitler in 1943 was unsuccessful." The over-imagined memory of the deep relationship of Arabs and the Nazi Party is inaccurate in many ways that create a bigger rift. This is a challenge for many Jews, the fact that Arabs were in desperate need of alliances and were fearful of the immigration of Jews into Palestine. This at all does not enter the memory of Jews. I just want to stop there because I think one of the questions I start with is, why do Muslims see
Hi, David.
Jews as colonists or
Hello.
hello? So what happens is that there is this impression of Europe already in the minds of Arabs and Muslims in colonial places. So when Jews are migrating into Palestine at that time, they're not seen as Jews. For Jews, they're seen as Europeans. It's a very strange kind of moment and perception, but if you read the narratives of this migration, and I'm not just talking about Israel and Palestinians, I'm talking about the migration that all Arabs talk about. It's not a Jewish migration, it's a European migration. And it's a very subtle a moment that needs to be sort of opened up and really talked about. And I think that this can be done. So this is the challenge that I talk about. But in 1941 and 2, when German troops entered Muslim-populated territories in the Balkans, in North Africa, in Crimea, and the Caucasus, and approached the Middle East and Central Asia, Berlin began to see Islam as politically significant. The Muslims also had their alleged enemies. There's the colonial forces, right? The British Empire, the Soviet Union, America, and Jews. In other words, the Arabs and Germans could create an imaginary alliance based on ideology, not religious belief. The promotion of an alliance with the Islamic world was first and foremost motivated by material interests and strategic concerns, not by ideology. Another major concern for the German Nazis in their policy toward Muslims was its racism and prejudice. Muslims and Arabs were also seen as, and I think you're all aware of this, seen as racially inferior and of non-European descent. For example, the Arabs secured their position with German Nazis as much as they could, since they witnessed the brutality of the camps in the Arab lands under the Vichy-led Nazi Party, and knew that this was a racial prejudice that could fall on them as well. Arabs were not in charge, nor were they confident that this colonial-led occupation was going to be in their favor. Politically, Arabs were not on sure ground either. To many Germans and their European partners, Arabs were only marginally less inferior than Jews. As one German officer said ominously to an Arab, "Your time will come. We will finish with the Jews, then we will take care of you." If indifference meant that Arabs were primarily concerned with securing the means for their survival, finding food, shelter, work, and so on, and could not spare the effort to act on their natural human sympathy toward their Jewish compatriot, then theirs was an understandable, even legitimate indifference, born necessity. And yet the shooting of Muslim prisoners of war on the Eastern Front shows that this official policy toward Muslims was by no means straightforward. Nazi Germany's policy towards Muslims was in many ways entangled with the history of the Holocaust. On the ground, German soldiers encountered Muslim, Roma, Jewish converts to Islam. Jewish sects that had adopted some Islamic practices, and Muslims who were taken as Jews. The lines, and the reason that Muslims were taken as Jews is because, they were circumcised. And then the lines between this population were not always clear to the Nazi executioners. This could lead to the murder of Muslims who were mistaken for Jews, and vice versa. On the other hand, in North Africa, Arabs were integrated into the Vichy-led occupation and forced to obey orders because they too were under an occupation and threatened by the Vichy, not just in terms of power or force, by their own racial composition. A lot of the Arabs were also imprisoned. The Arabs, Muslims fared better than the Jews, but if it were up to the Nazis, they would kill them as well. Muslims did not know about the death camps in Europe, and most Muslims at this time were under colonial rule. The Vichy government of France had taken control of Morocco and Tunisia, and Libya was under direct German rule. Here again, the memory of colonialism still looms large for the Muslim Arabs. That seems to be ignored, a memory of humiliation, lack of control, and a nostalgia for the grandeur of Muslim empires. Many understand that colonialism took place, but the impact of colonialism on Muslim countries had an enormous impact that is still experienced by Muslims of all backgrounds. The vast scope of Muslim lands occupied by the British, Dutch, Italians, and Germans is a complex but important story that connects Muslims to the Shoah. A memory of being ruled and stripped of their own ruling styles, culture, language, and even religion is the indelible place where Muslims still mourn the past. This past that perhaps has not been so ideal is idealized by religious identity, which was the only foothold that they had through the colonial periods. The Germans were well aware of Islam and its principles and used religion as a vehicle to seduce the Muslims in offering an alliance and power. David Mutadil says that on a more general level, the relationship between Muslims and the Nazis addressed the relationship between religion and power, specifically the role of religion as an instrument in world politics and military conflict. It contributes to our understanding of the ways by which governments actively sought to use religion to expand their political influence and to wage wars. Attempts to mobilize religious groups were part of a great power politics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Religious groups, populations defined along religious lines, were regularly considered powerful political forces that could be utilized. This ideology was used as a means to an end, the empowering of Al-Husseini, focusing on Arab countries, including the Soviet Union. The Germans were able to promote Islamic ideas to convince the Arabs to align with them. The deep and thorough ways in which officials created Berlin's Muslim moment is often overlooked. Many documents today at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I have done some archival work on this specifically in the tracing services, point to the many stories of ordinary Muslims who were caught up in this war, whether on the front lines or in the camps. Muslims were in labor camps in Germany who were escaping their own oppression, communism, and colonialism. Turks, Albanians, and Russian Muslims were found in DP camps who had suffered alongside Jews. The tracing services is actually really useful, and they were always identified as, Muslims were either identified as Islam or Muslim or Turk. But it's still not digitized enough. I was there for a week, I only got through like 150 names. And we're still working on that. I know people in the museum are working on this, but this could be very interesting research also for Muslims to look at, not just, non-Muslims. The first place where Germans were advancing in Paris, they also encountered Muslims, 10,000 of them, which was a sizable minority. And these Muslims were immigrants who practiced and belonged to the Grand Mosque of Paris, which was run by Si Qadur Ben Gabit, the Imam of the mosque, who asked the help of Nazis by volunteering to help them spread Nazi propaganda in return for the survival of his community. This is very interesting because Ben Gabit wanted to help Muslim inmates he knew that were in prisoner camps and elsewhere, but he also changed the names of dozens of Jews and hid them from the Nazis. An example is, and we don't have all the documentation, I know there's a book out, but it's still not historically documented properly, but there are names like Albert Assouline, an Algerian-born Jew who was rescued, Salim Halali, a popular musician, and some that we cannot find much record of, but it was certain that they were helped and escaped by converting to Islam or their names being changed by the Imam. As Shoah denial and relativism spread into Muslim countries, some Jews and Muslims struggle to keep their history and connections to one another alive by telling stories of past cooperation and faith. However, anti-Semitism still looms large in Arab and Muslim discourse, as I've discussed in my book very openly, discounting the many positive roles that the two traditions have shared. For the past few years, many Arab and Muslims, academics, professionals, and much media have perpetuated some of the anti-Semitism and the roots of the Shoah as a hoax. This went through several phases. For some time, the problem was that the number of Jews killed was disputed. Then the roots of denial were later exposed, but the role of the Shoah in Jewish, Western, and Arab consciousness changed, intensifying over time to more of an anti-Semitic European model. And as Litvak and Wedman write, and this is looking at the 80s, 90s, and 2000, the Jewish Holocaust is a historical lie, the greatest Zionist lie history had ever known, are but two of the numerous expressions that appeared in the Arab discourse to deny the historical veracity of the Holocaust. Jews and Arabs attach their shared memories of cooperation and rescue because of all of these issues. The rescue of all Jews, including ones who were able to escape, lies in the heart of Albania. Jews were all sheltered under the promise and oath of Islam by Muslims in Albania, and as well as Christians. Albania, which is 70% Muslim, was the only country in Europe to rescue all of its Jews. Some still hold on to the belongings of the survivors in the hope that their items can be returned. There was also an Iranian Schindler, Al-Husseini Zardari, who changed the Semitic blood lineage of Jews to a Mosaic lineage, arguing that they were not Semitic. The Jews in Morocco, who were protected by King Mohammed as Moroccan citizens throughout until the Vichy took over. The Tunisian man like Khaled Abdul Wahab, who sheltered Jews in his home at a farm in the back. The Muslim families in Sarajevo, who helped a Jewish family during the deportations, and in return, the Jewish community remembered and helped the Bosnian Muslim family during the siege of Sarajevo, some 50 years later. Inayat Nur Khan, who is one of my heroes, the Indian Muslim British spy, who was killed at Dachau for helping the Allies in Germany, and the Egyptian doctor Muhammad al-Halami, who rescued a family and risked his own life. The cooperation of these Muslims and the memory of the Jews who were rescued echoed throughout the world, yet we erase the memory of one another's risks, complexities, and problems that are scattered lives as we cover ourselves in the fog of political recent history. The memories of Jews became to many Muslims and European anti-Semitism that seeped throughout the culture. The image of the Jew was reconceived as a colonial European Jew, the one who took over the land, the rich, and the lobbyists in the world. The memory of the Jews during the Holocaust for Muslims disappeared fast in the guise of Israel, but also the new remapping of Muslim countries under colonialism. Simultaneously, if one remembers the loss of 1/3 of the population of Jewry during the Holocaust, one must also take into account but the loss and humiliation of Muslims, as we may be able to retell in ways the memory of one another. But I leave you not on the negative note of darkness, but of hope, courage, and optimism that I have been fortunate to be surrounded by Jews and Muslims who brave their lives for peace and understanding. They shelter one another in places like Palestine and Israel. Jewish and Muslim women who have opened 43 chapters in the nation by community building of Sisterhood and Shalom in the U.S. who prayed for Jewish and Muslim victims at Auschwitz. I was asked to speak in front of 35,000 people in Brooklyn as a march of solidarity against anti-Semitism in New York and the nation. In Berlin, Muslims have created the Kreuzberg Center that teaches immigrants about anti-Semitism. Syrian refugees that have befriended local Berliners and Jews by reaching out to help them. The Goethe Gymnasium in Berlin that invites speakers to challenge the stereotypes in their students. Bosnian Muslims who are educating and working on interfaith peace in Sarajevo, and my own center who brings Jews, Muslims, and Christians and survivors together so that they can each hear each other's voices that are buried by the louder, more gruesome memories of one another. It is not now, yesterday, or tomorrow that we need to have these conversations, but always. Thank you. So I want to share just five minutes of a video that's 10 years old. Like I said, it's one of my favorite parts of my life, that I had really the honor to do this as a Muslim woman. Do you know many Muslims? Have you talked to Muslims?
No, I wish I would. Because for me, it doesn't matter. You are Muslim, you are a human being. I love people. When I speak, I never ever think about that it's Muslim or Catholic or Protestant or whatever. I just see a human being, and that's the way I was raised, actually.
What is your main message to Muslims about the Holocaust?
I don't know if anyone completely understand what happened there. You know, I mean, what happened, that's true. Why that did happen and the whole world was looking at and didn't do anything, that's one thing I don't understand. But one thing I understand, that we should all like each other, talk to each other, and try to understand each other.
Talking to you, I forget that, you know, you are Muslim today?
Yes.
Okay, I totally forget that, but...
But that's good. We shouldn't look
yeah,
at our...
I know.
That's
but
precisely the point of this practice.
I know, I realize that
yeah.
the question I have for the Muslims, do you really believe that any paper we sign is going to have an effect on the children that you teach to kill? That's the question I want to ask.
Okay, perfect question. The gas chambers especially are seen by a lot of people as a fabrication. As difficult as it is for me to ask you this, could you perhaps shed light on that from your perspective?
Well, you know, only a totally ignorant human being would say today that it didn't happen. I don't have the right to forgive. It's not my job to forgive. God is the only one that can forgive. I only have to remember and be aware all the time of what can happen. So, you know, I try to do my job.
Okay.
Like you are doing yours. Have you been threatened?
Have I been threatened? Yes.
I'm sure.
As a Muslim, yes. Both in my community and outside of my community.
I'm sure.
So, I mean, I also spend a lot of time, Renee, going to Jewish temples and showing similarities of justice between Judaism and Islam.
I don't care what color, what creed, what you do in life, as long as you're a decent person. That's enough for me. Now, let me ask you a question. Are you a religious Muslim?
I believe, yes.
You believe? You believe do you believe there's somebody upstairs who's going to guide your life, who's going to make you a better person?
I don't think that person is going to make me a better person, but I think there's something there that is not guiding me.
Then you go through your life with rules, the rules that the Muslims are giving you. Is that what it is? I'm asking you. I'm not judging you. I'm asking you a question.
No, I don't go with the rules that
because a lot of people do that, right, including the Jewish religion.
If a Muslim is watching, what do you want to say to them?
I say, get an education. Learn about life. Don't be in your little sphere only, and just don't see anybody else but yourself. And if you do that, if you get educated, maybe you will have a better chance in this world.
So there's stories that were told during Muhammad's life in the 6th century. Jihad means struggle. Okay. So jihad has several connotations. One is holy war. Not direct translation, but the result is holy war, which means if someone comes to your house and forces you and your family out or kills you, you have the right to defend yourself with struggling against them through jihad. However, it doesn't mean that you kill them. The Holocaust is unique, right? Holocaust was not just in Germany, it was in Poland, it was in Czech, it was in Italy, it was all over, it was in Tunisia. So the whole point of the Holocaust was to exterminate Jews off the face of the earth. I don't care if someone wants to sit there and deny it, they can do it till they're blue in the face. Thank you. Can't hear you, Niels.
See, I have to unmute myself as well. You also were muted just in transition from the movie to the conclusion of your talk.
Yes, I said thank you so much. I know that I'm actually at time now.
No, that was perfect timing. Thank you so much for your talk. We're going to open it up now a little bit in a moment to question and answers, but there was such a complexity in your talk that if you don't mind, I'll be a little bit unpacking it one more time for everyone. I think there really, for starters, there's something about the history of the Holocaust in there, and that breaks into all of the categories. There's something about the perpetrators that appears in a different way if we look at it from your perspective. There's obviously something about the victims that is different, and so on and so forth. And then we have the whole layering one more time in the realms of memory. But I think there's one element that you emphasized also again at that clip that I just want to maybe start with, and that's the geography. You mentioned all the countries, and I think that's something often that we forget, that in many ways Hitler's ambitions were not limited by the Mediterranean. They were ultimately limited by what's called Operation Torch, meaning the American and the British troops defeating Rommel. But in lots of ways, Walter Rauff, who had been instrumental in developing the gas vents, was sitting, so to speak, in the wings to unleash the killing squads also in North Africa. So that I think that whole idea of differentiating these realms and not thinking about these realms as also constituting the places of victimhood, that's already, I think, really, really problematic. But I want to get to the other side of this geography, and that's Europe is not that homogeneous and never has been. And you say this by talking about the colonies, but neither has Paris been that homogeneous, or Amsterdam or Berlin. In many ways, during the 1920s, many individuals from North Africa, Jews and Muslims and others, like others, travel across. They look for better opportunities. And so by the time the Nazis occupy France, it entails a good number of minorities, so that in lots of ways, Muslims are also Europeans in many ways. And I think that's right. Would you agree with that? And that's in lots of ways, they're not just the outsider to its geography.
I think that if you're talking about it depends on what year you're talking about, because I know that one of the things that, a lot of the European countries, and everyone's specific, but have a very different relationship with Muslims than, say, the United States, right? Because there was this colonial reality. There was this push to invite Muslims in to do work labor, as you know, being from Germany. I think they were always outsiders, Neil, and I think they're still struggling with this issue of, the outsider, insider, especially now in Europe, which is what, a lot of Jews struggle with, right? So you could look at all of Europe and look at this history also in terms of Jewish Muslim history, but no, I would say that Islam has always been sort of seen as the other, the other, the Orient. German scholars were the first ones to sort of talk about it. Then you have the British scholars like H.R. Gibb talked about Islam not as Islam but Mohammedism. So there's a whole history of that culminates into this notion, and I think that is still an ongoing issue with immigrants in many parts of Europe. I go to Italy every year to the Jewish ghetto to teach in Venice, and I see the migrant population, which is Bengali, North African, that are kept in the kitchen, that are not really part of the fabric of the city at all. So that's still, that other foreignness is still very much part of the mix.
maybe I refer more to the interwar migrations. So in many ways, after the First World War, you have Egyptians who come to Lyon and open up shops there. They migrate to Paris. They come to Berlin. So in lots of ways, when the war begins, many of them get caught out in the middle of it by unfortunately being in the wrong place, but therefore they're right from the beginning on the deportation lists, and so we can track them. I have one of my students is here, and I don't want to call on her, then she feels maybe too much pressure, but she did in her own way a lot of work on trying to track Egyptian Jews who had migrated to during the 1920s to France, and who end up then on the deportation list. And I think so in other words, the victims don't just come from North Africa or from the Middle East. Some of the Muslim victims from Arabic states are quite literally in Paris, or they're in Bulgaria, or they're in Greece, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, but that's what I was talking about, the documentation, that they were caught in places in Europe as Muslims because they were there for economy, or they were escaping something. And these were the names that the documentation center has in terms of, looking at the different Muslim, like where, and there's very few stories about where they ended up and what happened to them. So that's another interesting thing that you can look at.
And if I may, and then I'll hand it over, just coming back to the realms of memory, since you mentioned Berlin, I might as well ask. So Berlin is an interesting case, I think, because there, it has been really important in many ways for the Jewish Museum to open up its program to all of the Berliners. And that's a very diverse group of people right now, considering the many immigrants. So that the we that needs this kind of wider acknowledgement, I think in lots of ways exists today also in many of the capitals, where the audience in Paris is that of Jews, of Christians, of Muslims, who are ideally talking to each other about the Holocaust. And the same holds true in Berlin, but also obviously in places like Dallas or in places like New York, that our own communities have also changed. And we are not separating ourselves any longer so clearly that we can afford to keep this all kind of stashed away in its different pockets. You follow what I'm?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just talk about Berlin. I love Berlin, by the way, and I've enjoyed myself there. It's nothing against Berliners. I think for me, I was trying to point out that moment of being in the midst of being a Muslim doing Holocaust work, and the reaction to that. And these are just local people. They're not scholars or anything. But I sense that, in the sense of like the Holocaust fatigue, in a way, that goes on with these generations that are taught about the Holocaust, especially in places like Germany or even in France. So that's what I was responding at. But I also wanted us to see what happens to a person who is, kind of representing both, and how that's seen in, 2016. That's 5 years ago, right? So I think that was the anecdote I wanted us to sit with. It wasn't to make a statement about all of Germany or Berlin at all, because I think we have many lessons to learn from Germany, and I talk about that in my work on racism. But I think it's important for us to see how, challenging this can be with the advent of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and how you're sort of like challenged by that all the time in every moment. Not because I'm a Jew, but because I'm a Muslim, and sometimes because I'm advocating for Jews, and that's a problem, right? So it's like this weird sort of situation you're caught in all the time.
You're getting already lots of cheers in the chat, but let me just ask one last question. And then, how do you present something for Muslim eyes? I mean, there are many eyes, presumably, but yet because there are so few people who address this, you're forced into that position of, so to speak, having to give a talk about all of this collapsed into one. But if I just imagine, if you would have invited me in reverse and I would have to present on German eyes, I would say, no, I really don't want to do this. I really can't do that. There are so many different ways in which Germans may or may not think about the Holocaust. I can't collapse that and bring it all together. How do you deal with that challenge, that there's expectation that there's this quote unquote one narrative or one story?
There's a really good big footnote in the beginning of my book that says, I don't represent all Muslims, and when I refer to Muslim and Jew, it doesn't mean everybody, right? But it's in the context of what I'm talking about. Um, I'll just tell you about this title. First of all, I wanted to use the word Shoah because for me that's really important in the Holocaust. And as a non-Jew, I'll tell you why. Because I've been on many, many scholarly discussions where the Holocaust is used for many other things. And so I wanted it to have its specificity for this purpose. And also it's kind of Hebrew kind of identity. The other thing is Shoah through Muslim. I just wanted to be a Muslim that just said, look, it happened, it was factual, it was historical, it's on paper. I mean, 'cause I know it sounds dumb when I'm saying it, but
No.
really that was it. That I just wanted to say, okay, you know what? You can go and relativize it, and it's a very kind of like, and I wrote it, so it'd be like more of like trade in between trade and scholarly, so many people could read it, and more people have read it because of that. And I just wanted people to say, look, there are Muslims that accept this enormity fully in historical reality. As that's it.
Very good. Let's open it up to everyone who wants to ask questions, either by unmuting yourself or by writing out a question. Otherwise, I'm just paraphrasing some of the comments here. And there's one, one of the last ones from Marcy Littell, who just thanks you in many ways and says that it has been a great honor, to have you participate, now again at the Annual Scholars Conference. Thank you for your continued participation.
Thank you,
And
Marcy.
she has great admiration and appreciation for your work, but you know that. Thank you. This comes from Marcy, even though it's coded under her daughter. Questions for our distinguished speaker now.
So Dr. Romer, rather than asking people to unmute, I do have quite a long list of people who have already submitted some, so maybe we can get through those first. Before we do get to that, I did put in the chat the information about our final talk today at 5 o'clock. Please join us for the Mitchell L. and Miriam Lewis Barnett lecture with Peter Konstam. I also very much wanted to thank Dr. Afridi for this amazing talk. And I also wanted to thank the Jaffe family in general for their longtime support, but also in particular for creating this lecture and making it happen, because this is the Michael and Elaine lecture. Michael and Elaine Jaffe lecture. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into some of these questions because we want to be respectful of the time. I had many questions in the chat to me about how your biography either aids or maybe hinders your research, if you could discuss that.
My biography, meaning my identity?
Your background. So whether you think that whether you think it's more of a hindrance or more of a help to be able to have that different perspective?
I mean, I think it can be both. I mean, we're all biased and we all have our ways of thinking. I just want to say a little bit about how I grew up. I was, born in Pakistan, and then I was raised in Europe, basically, and the Middle East, and then I came to the United States. So one of the things that, I mean, when you're a child and you're moving around every 2-3 years, you're, frustrated. But in retrospect, it was a real gift because it made me think through many languages and cultures, and I was friends with Jews, and my parents were very open about me going for Hanukkah and them coming for end of Ramadan or Iftar. So it was this kind of multicultural perspective, but living in a household that was Muslim and practicing. So I think it can be a gift when you move around so much, but I also think I definitely have my own bias. I've never acquitted myself of that in terms of my own belief in Islam and how I practice it, maybe, or being a woman, or being a minority woman. So there's all kinds of ways that you can look at this.
Okay. Another question is, can you speak further about the idea that Muslims saw Jews as European rather than indigenous to the land of Israel? How does this perception contribute to the issues of Holocaust memory within Muslim-Jewish relations in the 21st century?
That's a great question. I mean, this is really precisely what I think is so important for us to understand. And it's hard because, again, we're talking about perception. So that's why I discuss colonization so much, Niels, to answer some of your questions too, is because the colonization that happened in Arab Muslim countries were done by Europeans. And Jews that came, that Arabs saw coming into Palestine and Israel were not seen as Jews, but they were seen as European because they actually were coming from Europe, right? So they brought with them European values and mindset. Of course, I mean, Jews were in Europe for thousands of years. This is the moment where Arabs saw Jews as European and not European Jews necessarily, and saw that the colonial world was helping the Jews and not helping the Arabs. Remember, when, for example, you look at the laws in Morocco for Jews and Arabs under the Vichy, they're very different. What they do with Jewish natives of Morocco and what they do with Arab natives with Morocco. So sometimes Jews can have citizenship and sometimes they cannot. Sometimes, you know, so there's all this kind of battling going on in terms of North Africa and what happens under colonial rule. That's why it's so important to understand that history of how were Jews and Arabs living under colonial rule in North Africa. That's very, very important because it also prescribes how we see one another. And of course, we had really, I mean, Jews and Muslims also had wonderful relationships. But I don't want to over-idolize that because I feel like it's always like, oh, you know, we were together and we were so wonderful. And there were very, very important times. I think the 12th century in Iraq was the best time when Jewish and Muslim scholars were translating, you know, Aristotle together. I mean, that was an incredible force. That I like to celebrate because there was this idea that we believe in science, we believe in progress, we believe in the Renaissance, and that was something that I think was really strong in places like Baghdad, where Jews really contributed to the libraries of Baghdad that a lot of them, as you know, unfortunately were destroyed, but some have been, you know, saved. But that's how I would answer it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to kind of read the last two together because we are well past 3 o'clock. That way you can kind of speak to both of them. And then I think that may be where we have to end. So one of the questions, and I will mispronounce the word, my apologies. Do you have experience speaking with religious Orthodox or Haredi Jews? I'm so sorry, I don't know how to say that. And the other is, in speaking to Muslim groups, have there been differences in responses from North African, Middle Eastern, and Asian groups?
Okay, number one, no, I have not spoken to Haredi groups, but I do work with the Hebrew Institute in Riverdale here, which is Orthodox Jewish. We do a lot of programs with each other, and their yeshiva actually partner with my students and Muslim students, because I'm the Muslim student advisor on campus, and we do an amazing work with Holocaust survivors in the area. So yes, Orthodox Jews are open to this, but I work with all kinds of Jewish and Muslim communities. Muslims, in terms of their reaction to this, you know, I think Muslims are open to understanding about the Holocaust, and they're open to becoming educated. I was just approached recently, 2 weeks ago, by a Turk and an Egyptian to help them form a curriculum for Brooklyn's Muslim schools, which is great. I mean, so there are these little initiatives, but I can't really speak for all Turks and all that. I mean, I'm from Pakistan, and I have had some really bad arguments back home about Jews, and they have not been pleasant. So I kind of try to as lightly as I can because, you know, there's so much myth out there, it's unbelievable. I think Elaine had a question. Jaffe? No.
Elaine, do you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
And it was very illuminating in terms of the history, and never thought about the colonialism and the different ethnic origins of the various groups and how that played into it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Elaine. I really appreciate it. I'm honored.
Okay, good. So you got more applause. I think that unfortunately brings us to an end. I think this is the moment where you now are entitled to unmute yourself, to loudly clap.
Say thank you and clap.
And say yes, and say thank you. Use your electronic things, real things. Unmute yourself, thank our wonderful speaker in any shape or form that you want.
There we are.
Thank you, Mehnaz. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you so much.
very much.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your work.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna leave, all right?
You stay on for a moment, Mehnaz, if you don't mind. I'll wait until everyone.